Thank you, Tiffany. O tira tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to thank Tiffany for that brief introduction, and on behalf of Graham and myself, welcome you all who have joined us online for this webinar for the release of the National Strategy for Emerging Contaminants. But before we begin, we just wanted to open our webinar in karakia. Nō reira, kei ino i tātou. Whakatakatahu ki te u, whakatakatahu ki te tonga, kia mā, kina ki uta, kia mā, taratara ki tae, hi aka ana te atakura, he uka, he tio, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Kia ora mai tātou. Over to you, Christine.
Kia ora, and welcome to this really special LINKOnline webinar. Today we're presenting on behalf of a wide team of experts and stakeholders who have worked together for over 10 years to create this national strategy for emerging contaminants for Aotearoa, New Zealand. Emerging contaminants are natural or manufactured chemicals, often new to usage, and largely not well understood in terms of environmental impact and generally not monitored. They could potentially pose a risk to our biodiversity, food production, fishing and aquaculture industries. There is increasing concern about the potential of emerging contaminants to threaten the health and well-being of our people and our unique ecosystems. Jamie Ataria and Graham Sevick-Jones will present the strategy, talk about its development and pose the question, where to from here? We've allowed some time for your questions at the end of the presentation and we'll do our best to respond in the time available. We do want to hear your thoughts and responses to information, so please do add any questions or comments for the team into the chat box on the webinar control panel. I'll see you again at the end. Now handing over to the team.
Kia ora tātou. Ko rima tuka te monga I runei taku nako. Ko te awa, ko ranga te awa I mahia nei aku I maharara. I mihi ana ki ngā tohu nehi o te whanganui Atari I noho nei au. Ko Graham Sevick-Jones tōku ingoa, no ngā umātou aho. I am Graham Sevick-Jones. I'm General Manager for Science, Knowledge Translation for Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, and I'll be one of the presenters. Jamie.
Tēnā no tātou katoa. My name is James Ataria, and I have whakapapa affiliations to Rongo Mai Wahine, Ngāti Kaumunu in the Northern Hawke's Bay and to Ngāti Raukawa just north of Taupo. I'm currently employed part-time at Cawthorne, at the Cawthorne Institute in Nelson, as a researcher in 2 contaminant-based MB-funded research programs, in addition to working within the Māori business development team there. My involvement with the strategy goes right back to its origins, along with Graham and a few other people, and I've remained in contact with the development of the strategy throughout the years. And it's my great pleasure today to assist Graham with this presentation. So kia ora mai tātou katoa. Next slide, please, Graham. So while Graham's getting that, oh, here it is. So I guess we wanted to, we realised that certainly people who are joining this webinar this morning, the issue of emerging contaminants actually might be a relatively new concept. So we thought it prudent to firstly provide a definition. And so I'll just add to that wonderful introduction that Christine just gave. But certainly for the purposes of the emerging contaminant strategy, we've adopted the definition as provided by the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, which defines an emerging contaminant as a microorganism or chemical that has historically not been considered a contaminant, but has the potential to enter the environment and cause known or suspected negative impacts on environment and or people. Emerging contaminants are not commonly monitored, but they may be present in the environment on a global scale due to activities in our towns, cities, and their agricultural and industrial practices. In some cases, the release of the emerging chemical or microorganism into the environment has occurred for a long period of time, but they may not have been recognised until new detection methods were developed. In other cases, the synthesis of new chemicals or changes in the use and disposal of existing chemicals can create new sources of emerging contaminants. Now, certainly, as Christine mentioned at the beginning, there is this, globally, there's an increasing concern about the potential of emerging contaminants to threaten the health and well-being of people and unique ecosystems and biodiversity. Now, these are all pertinent factors for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we also have a significant and large primary sector.
This is, as Jamie just mentioned, there's a long journey that we've taken for the development of the strategy. It's actually involved what we like to think of as a cast of thousands. It's sort of started life from a group of scientists, experts and community leaders within the context of an iwi partnership that brought together Māori and Pākehā knowledge. The group acknowledged we needed to move beyond a purely reactive approach and looking at what other methods and approaches to manage the risks we could actually undertake. So some of this group ultimately formed the basis for the National Emerging Contaminants Advisory Panel, which short form is National Advisory Panel. That was formed under the MBIE Endeavour funded Emerging Organics Contaminant Program. The strategy itself was actually helped with the development, and its development was helped by Envirolink, which is by a couple of the regional councils supported that, and the Royal Society Catalyst funding. But essentially the main focus over the last few years has been through the Emerging Contaminants, Emerging Organic Contaminants Program for MBIE. You can see on the timeline here that well, since 2006, there's been a concerted effort to actually look at how we actually manage emerging contaminants, what sort of research is needed, and there's been a core group of people, as Jamie pointed out, they've actually followed this through. So effectively since 2009, we have built on the hui and reports that have been instigated by researchers and resource managers. We're working in partnership with Māori and in conjunction with government officials, industry and other key thought leaders. And from this, it was proposed that the vision for Aotearoa-New Zealand strategy realised through 3 goals could be developed. So the 3 goals that we have developed actually underpin the current strategy, and we'll talk about those shortly. We wanted also to provide for a dual knowledge system approach with Mātauranga Māori to help shape the direction of the strategy. And back in between 2006 2009, that was probably reasonably novel in an approach. Often we tended to be science-led, so we actually wanted the broader community input into the development of the strategy and how we would actually do it. So this brings us to today. The National Advisory Panel has helped refine what we have, and so we've now got to the point where we've actually been able to release 3 documents. I'd also like to actually acknowledge Chris Arbuckle and Karen Bell, who have been instrumental in this whole journey and have done a lot of the scribing and sort of negotiating around the goals and vision and mission that we had. So we've culminated now in 3 documents. So the 3 documents are effectively a plan on a page, so it's just gives a brief commentary on the vision, the mission, and these 3 goals. The A3 document that we've also produced actually gives a little bit more information around those goals and what we hope to achieve. And the 3rd document gives a lot more around the detail and history and the background to development of the strategy. As you've seen through the timeline, it goes actually over a long period, and the commitment through the various people involved could be commended. Actually, it's through that we've actually got a much tighter and more inclusive community around emerging contaminants, and I think that as most people I think that have been involved in strategies before realise it actually is quite a long journey. So the vision from the group that we've now developed and this hopefully resonates with many people is actually a healthy Aotearoa New Zealand safeguarded against the emerging contaminants. The mission, protecting Aotearoa New Zealand's prosperity, heritage and health through partnership, leadership, transparency and collaboration on the threat of emerging contaminants. Now, both the vision and mission that we have here actually have set the framework in which we'd actually develop the strategy in its full form. So the strategy actually now has 3 goals. So the goals are, goal 1 is around improving knowledge and understanding about ECs. Goal 2, identifying research and development possibilities for improving our knowledge. Goal 3, provide direction, leadership and support to enable Aotearoa New Zealand to understand the effects. So I'll hand it over to Jamie now to talk a little bit more about those 3 things.
Great, thanks, Graham. And as Graham said, the strategy is comprised of these 3 goals or whāinga, and each of them is embedded within a te tiriti or waitangi approach and structure. And the goals themselves follow the classic, I guess, communication, research, and leadership type structure. So the first goal relates to communication, and really is the part of the strategy that is about improving knowledge and understanding of emerging contaminants using quality local and international research. But it's also about employing critical communication pathways to deliver the relevant information to important decision makers in industry. The second goal refers to research and talks to the requirement of having the necessary research infrastructure, and by that I mean people, abilities, resources, and tools, and that these are well connected in order to advance our knowledge and improve our understanding of the fate and impact of emerging contaminants, and also the prioritization and the best management of the risks to environment and to people. The final goal really talks to leadership, and specifically the strategic connectivity and I guess the communication that's required to decision makers in industry, and also the provision of support via best quality national and international data. Now, Graham will follow this with some thinking about the work and some of our own thinking about how we planned to implement the strategy, and he'll also delve a little deeper into these 3 goals and really talk about some of the types of desired outcomes that are sought.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So development of the goals in some effect is actually some of the easier part of a strategy to do. So how are we actually going to implement that, and what were we going to do within this program to actually help that course of action? So the strategy has, for the implementation, we've come up with 4 streams of work that we believe would be appropriate for implementing it. As Jamie's already covered, there's 3 core themes: leadership, research, and communication. We also think it's very relevant to have a monitoring review process within this. One thing we're very aware of is that we are actually talking about a more complex type issue with emerging contaminants. There's a lot of moving parts within this, and it really speaks to sort of One Health when you're actually looking at this. And recognizing that it's actually quite mobile, then we actually need to be reasonably agile around the approach and how we actually work through things. So what we see this year could change next year. So we think monitoring and review of the process is actually quite important to actually be able to react in an appropriate way. At the essence of all this is to move us away from purely a reactive approach to actually looking at how we can do that within a framework that is more proactive. But we also recognise that things come out of left field often, and that if we have a reasonably good structure, communication pathways, we have good leadership, and we actually have the research that underpins this that can actually move more into that proactive from reactive, we actually are in a much better place to actually delivering to it. So the people that sit in behind this, which is numerous people, actually really committed to ensuring that New Zealand is safeguarded from emerging contaminants, and that we are actually communicating and working much more effectively than what we may have in the past. And certainly the strategy that we have developed has actually been used in other programs to actually provide some of the thinking around how you may actually operate or work to actually provide more impact to the work that is being done. So each of these goals needs an action plan that supports them. The endeavour program itself, and the people involved in that, we recognise that actually we can't actually do the implementation of a lot of this. We acknowledge quite early on that there's two key components that this group can do. One is to provide the overall framework on how a strategy could be implemented, and therefore how an agency or agencies that took this on would actually be able to do that. And secondly, provide a rich resource as far as the people that are connected into this to actually help that. The one other component that's very relevant to the research that's being done is actually to provide for an approach to actually looking at how the research is done. So I'll cover a little bit more of that now. So in regards to the communication, and Jamie has picked up on some of this, what we're trying to do is actually seek the sort of these sorts of outcomes. So in partnership with Māori and end users and government, we're engaged with and using critical communication pathways to deliver relevant and useful advice. Secondly, we're utilising international knowledge, and the research is identified, collated and communicated to Aotearoa New Zealand's decision makers. And thirdly, we're actually providing regular updates and providing to the community on emerging contaminants found in Aotearoa New Zealand's environment and their known effects. The communication side of it is extremely important, and there's a variety of approaches that can be done to put some of these outcomes in place. We've relied quite heavily on the methods and tools and approaches that come out of this area of social science and research to actually help this. So starting off looking at what it is we actually really need to do to actually provide those pathways. So how do you form the right governance? How do you form the right communities of interest? How do you form your social networks? All those components are a critical part of that communication process. The component that is probably the most comfortable part that we typically deal with is around the research side of it. And so the sorts of outcomes we're seeking in this is to be able to identify emerging contaminants, and management is then prioritised for Māori and government, as well as industry and other productive centres through multi-criteria decision support tools and effects-based prioritisation framework. So developing an approach and a way to actually better utilise the research potential in New Zealand that actually delivers clearer pathways for communication, impact and the results. We also want to be clear that there's a clear pathway for kaupapa Māori research and the development and use of mātauranga. We also believe that things like communication portals and information sharing platforms needs to be established for all interested parties and agencies with improved access across multiple information platforms. Also, we're very keen to ensure that a specific research program of work is established to enable the prioritisation of emerging contaminants research for use in resource management decisions and enabling policy development. So the research is not just around the physical or biological components. Actually, the research speaks quite fully into the social research areas, where a lot of that is actually necessary to provide pathways and understanding the pathways for effective impact from the research and science delivered. We do need to look at the specific research programs and to ensure that the work on and prioritising on emerging contaminants. Any research in emerging contaminants areas can be extremely expensive, so being able to find the right approach and processes to deliver that and the right prioritisation is really important. We also believe that the emerging contaminants characterisation remains relevant and current and accurate via the development of a relevant and fit for purpose emerging contaminants framework. This would include annual updates and reviews. So making sure that this is kept very much alive and that we do a annualised process to ensure that New Zealand is actually has the best research and science direction that it can at any one point in time. Leadership component within the strategy. We find it essential that Māori are proactively involved in mitigating the negative impacts of emerging contaminants on the environment through their mātauranga maora, tikanga and wawata. That the leadership is underpinned by quality international data and targeted national emerging contaminants research. We also acknowledge that the launch of the strategy and its socialisation is extremely important to gain further backing that such a thing for New Zealand is important and needs to sit within a domain of agencies to actually give effect into the future. We acknowledge that the strategic linkages and transparent communication result in great awareness of the risks of emerging contaminants to Aotearoa New Zealand. So we believe that this needs to be highly connected in a number of ways. Each level of connection, the relevant information going there to actually make it quite the breakthrough for the information can actually occur. And lastly, policy and management sectors are able to develop appropriate and timely responses to managing emerging contaminants in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Oops.
So thanks, Graham. So yeah, just wrapping up. Oh, sorry, we've got our last slide. Thank you. So Poto te tani whākei tamariki tonu really is our catchphrase and motto for the strategy, and I think it really does underpin our belief, that the emergence of these issues is unlikely to cease, and therefore it really does make sense to position our country's effort at the front end of the wedge to minimise impacts rather than sort of wait until the horse is well and truly bolted. And I think a recent example that we're all be aware of is COVID-19. I think it's a great example of that thinking. So with that, I think that draws a conclusion to the end of our presentation. I just want to make mention that we will make available the web links to the strategic documents that Graham has mentioned. So we do have your, for those that have registered, we do have your email address, and we'll be sure to send that web link out to those documents when it becomes available. So thank you for joining us for this webinar this morning, and I believe we have some time for some questions. Tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa.
Kia ora, and thanks very much, Jamie and Graham. That's been really interesting. Now, strangely enough, apart from, how to get the documents, because obviously people do want to read more about this, and you've just given them a little taster, we haven't got any questions. So now is the time, people. If you would like to put Jamie and Graham on the spot, I'm willing to help you with that. I've got a dumb question just to get us started, though. Give us some examples of some emerging contaminants, just so that we've got, something that maybe people that aren't working in this field understand what it is exactly that you're talking about. But a quick answer, because the questions are coming in now.
Okay, well, maybe I'll take a stab at that question. So yeah, great question, Christine, and I guess emerging contaminants, the name itself implies that that you may not have heard of them. So they may be new chemicals, or they may not have necessarily been flagged as problematic. But certainly a range of pharmaceuticals and personal care products, things that we use a lot in our daily lives, have been identified as a class of emerging contaminants. Microplastics, of course, we've been aware of the macroplastics issue for many years, but now there's a lot of research that is targeted around microplastics. Triclosan is another emerging issue is microorganisms that become resistant to things that are supposed to kill them. So again, through a range of personal care products that have antimicrobial chemicals put into them, where potentially they could be contributing to antimicrobial resistance. So there's I guess three fairly different examples of what emerging contaminant might look like.
Probably just to add to that, three that have been quite topical over the years is like cadmium in soils, which has been a lot of research done in that area now. PFAS, which was one of those firefighting chemicals used. Another one was DCD, which is a nitrate inhibitor. All those over the last number of years have popped out and have been quite topical in the news.
Fabulous. That's really helpful. Here's a tricky question. Is a national environmental standard being developed for emerging contaminants?
From my understanding, no, there's not. It is actually quite problematic. It has to actually almost sit at the policy level, because understanding what substances you're trying to actually provide a standard for is extremely difficult. As Jamie pointed out, there's a huge range of potential contaminants that can actually emerge and create problems. So from my perspective, I really think it sits at that policy level. How do you create a frame in which you can actually address quite quickly some of the issues, and how can you be proactive about that? And sometimes those are quite challenging to put into a national level response. But a national environment standard would probably be more about directing what you need to do and how you need to do, as opposed to the specific chemicals, because there could be a vast variety of those. There's millions and millions sitting out there at the moment that we actually know very little about.
Yeah, and I think just to add to Graham's, I think as an example, an analogy is it's all about the journey rather than the destination. And I think, as Graham said, it's important to develop a framework on how we best address and manage these issues as they emerge.
So here's a targeted aspect to the same question. How does any approach contained in the strategy link to other central government approaches? So I understand from this questioner that there is a national working group on PFAS products, for instance. Is there a connection?
I'd say yes, there is a connection. I know with a number of people involved in the national advisory panel are actually involved in some of those other working groups as well. We have been reasonably closely connected with some of the central government agencies, a lot of EB groups. So they're aware of the work we have been doing in this area. We wanted to actually do this presentation to actually get out what the final sort of product from, from a visualization point of view is. So the idea of the strategy now is actually where to from here, which is very much about what home or homes does this need to sit in to actually give real effect to this. We're providing an example of what an implementation pathway could be. We know within our Endeavour program, there's a couple of areas we really want to actually work on to actually help that further, but it does need to have a longer pathway than what it currently does within the vagaries of short research projects in which you can do. So we'll be actually looking at now, where does that home sit, and is it agency or agencies? Is it within Māori organisations or is it within central government? Where is the best place for it? And could it be a collaborative approach? We're not putting sort of anything on the table as this is exactly where it needs to go, because we recognise that it covers and connects to so many different organisations and people that it may be a novel approach that we need to take. So we'll explore those and provide some help on that side too.
Right, and this is kind of follows from that. When you're talking about emerging contaminants, is the focus, I guess, of that contamination primarily on fresh water?
No, I would say no, it's not. Obviously, we have our marine and coastal environments also subject, end of pipes. A lot of our terrestrial land-based activities, do end up in fresh water, but then eventually ends up around our coastline. So I think no to that question. It is a broader, it is applied to our environment as a whole.
Yep, I'd say it's the effects on the whole ecosystem, not just component parts of it.
Okay, that's great. One last question. Something that is often missed is that when the contaminant is phased out, contaminated soil, sediment and water remain. At what stage in the framework do you engage with contaminated land practitioners?
I think there's two components of the strategy that probably point to that. One is around the communication and actually looking at what are the pathways in which you actually get information out and how do you engage and involve the right people. So I mentioned before about the role of this social research and science in this. It's actually very important to ensure that if there is problems or issues associated with it, you actually know who to connect to and how to connect to and what actually enables those shifts to take place. So I would imagine, we've actually recognised within this program that there's a huge variety of people that need to be involved at any one point in time, and actually providing some guidance around what those structures are to ensure that you get the right connections. To actually be able to provide the information in the right manner to the right people actually is quite critical to ensuring that we can remain more on that proactive side than that reactive side.
And look, our time is up. sorry to pose a tricky one right at the end there, but there is a great wealth of questions and comments coming through to us, and we're really delighted to have heard from so many people with your questions. Rest assured, those questions will be responded to directly and also collectively posted to our website when we post the presentation up there. Watch your mailbox for a link from Graham or Jamie around the places that you can find all of this documentation and potentially get involved in the next steps. I'd like to say a big thank you to Jamie and Graham for a great presentation, and kia ora. We will see you again at our next webinar next month. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.